If you do cybersecurity today, then you're certainly aware of the issues that come up with the Linux operating system. I know for me personally, I started my career building security into Unix. So it's such a delight today to have a guest who's going to share with us some insight into how we protect modern Linux operating systems, which really are the workhorse behind cloud and almost everything you do. You may know that. If you don't, stick around. I think you're going to learn something. You'll enjoy our discussion today. Hi, this is Ed Amoroso from TAG. I'd like to welcome you to our discussion today. I have a very special guest here, my friend Austin Gadient, who is the CTO and co-founder of a very cool company called Vali Cyber that works in an area that's close to my heart, protecting Linux and doing security for, essentially for the, I want to say underbelly. We'll ask Austin in a minute whether it's the underbelly or maybe it's the overbelly. It's hard to say, but certainly something that I hope you'll stick around and listen to. Austin, welcome to New York. Nice to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you too. Thank you so much for having me.
This is one of my favorite topics. Protecting Linux is God's work. So I'm glad you guys are doing what you do. Tell us just quickly a little bit about the company, and then I want to get into some of the technology. But tell us about the company.
Yeah, so Vali Cyber is a Linux and hypervisor security company. So we provide security solutions, specifically a platform called Zero Lock to protect Linux systems from attacks. The main tenets behind Zero Lock's development are portability, performance, and efficacy. So it needs to be able to support many different types of Linux systems. It needs to be able to run in many different types of environments. It needs to be able to run in those environments without any sort of CPU or memory overhead on the systems because Linux systems are very demanding in that way. Then it has to actually be good at stopping attacks. Otherwise, why would you run a security tool?
And Zero Lock is not a kernel mod. These are things you're putting onto the Linux system. So
correct. It's just a service.
Easy to implement, I would think.
Right. It's just a service that runs in user space like some other service, like Apache or MySQL that you might run on a Linux system, and it supports everything going back to kernel 3.5, which is about 15 years old at this point. So pretty much everything in production we support today.
So let's start with the question you get asked all the time. What led you to start the company as one of the founders?
Yeah, so I guess I'll go back to my time in the Air Force. So I went to the Air Force Academy for my undergrad, and I got into the cybersecurity space at the Academy. I was on the Academy's competitive hacking team. And then after that, the Air Force sent me to MIT to do a master's in computer science. And
They couldn't find a better school.
I guess not.
Too bad.
I guess not.
I'm like teasing.
I think the program that I worked on for my master's thesis was a DARPA program called HACS. And HACS was all about autonomously finding and destroying botnets. And the approach that we took was very offensive in nature. So essentially what we did is we built a botnet that went around destroying other botnets. And my phase of the program was about getting access to systems so that we could destroy the bots that were on those systems. And to do that, we essentially launched attacks against them. We launched exploits and
you aiming for the CNC, or you got to hit the whole thing?
The whole thing, the whole thing. So we tried to identify systems that had the bots and then go around and just delete those bots off the systems.
Aiming at the CNC, it fluxes over to other, right? They're usually pretty resilient.
Yeah, exactly. And so all those systems we focused on were Linux systems. They were either Linux servers or Linux IoT devices. So I learned a lot about attacking Linux systems. Then after that, the Air Force sent me to Kirtland Air Force Base, where I worked on a space cybersecurity program, really two programs. One of them was called Stargate, the other one was called Chess. And Stargate was focused on ground systems. Chess was focused on flight computers and satellites themselves. And it turns out the ground systems and satellites that power our nation's security infrastructure and defense infrastructure are all Linux systems, essentially. So we were doing a lot of Linux security from a defensive perspective. And that's where I learned that a lot of the existing tools have significant drawbacks. Either they're not portable between different versions of Linux, they have problems in detecting attacks because they weren't specifically built for Linux from the start, or they just have performance issues that cause instability, or they use a lot of CPU or something like that. And so that's really what motivated me to start a company focused on Linux security, was the pain that I felt trying to protect those space assets.
I think even that big tech company that starts with an M, I think they use a lot of Linux too. So
yep, absolutely.
It's always surprising because one wouldn't expect, but they're the first ones to tell you that it's a very useful tool in a data center. So in terms of, let's get to the Air Force learning about Linux. So you're learning the operating system, but also learning threat. So take me from that to where you are now. Like the threat landscape, I would imagine, has grown significantly since you were first kind of mucking around with Linux. Take me along that journey. I think I know some of it, but I want to hear your perspective.
So one of the interesting things about Linux's history is it's really come into the mainstream within the past 1, maybe 2 decades, and it's an operating system that has a year-over-year growth of about 20%, double-digit year-over-year growth, whereas Windows
growth in
terms of the number of operating systems out there.
Yeah.
So
you just count.
There's just a lot of Linux out there today, and there's a growing number of Linux systems out there. And I guess I divide the security and threat landscape depending on the type of system that you're talking about. So you have your sort of enterprise servers; those could be in the cloud, or they could be in data centers. And the attacks that tend to affect those systems would be attacks that try to steal data. Maybe there's some database those systems talk to, and so they'll try to steal personal identifiable information or something like that. The other thing would be crypto mining. So attackers will launch.
Would ransomware being the first category in some sense? It's like a hybrid.
Ransomware definitely affects certain types of server systems, like web hosting providers have to worry about ransomware, because if their backups and their web assets get hit with ransomware, basically all their customer websites go down. That has happened a few times in the past. Crypto mining, however, is an attack where folks will try to essentially use all the CPU on the system to mine cryptocurrency, and that's how they make money from the attack.
Stuff, right?
And it's damaging to a company because all of a sudden you have this giant AWS bill or this giant GCP bill, and you have to pay your cloud provider a bunch of money for all this compute that you weren't actually using.
Yeah. It's a compliance mess too.
Yes,
it's
absolutely.
A disaster, right?
So I think the second type of system would be systems that either run critical workloads like hypervisors, or that store a lot of critical data like network attached storage NAS devices. So these sorts of systems are prime targets for ransomware. And the reason is that if you have a bunch of data that you can encrypt, then you can typically charge a large sum to get it decrypted. So there's a lot of motivation from the attacker's perspective to go encrypt those systems. Hypervisors are similar. They're running many different operating systems on top of them. So if you're able to attack the hypervisor, then all the operating systems can be shut down and encrypted at once. It's a very devastating attack for an enterprise. And so an enterprise is going to be very motivated to try and restore their systems, and so pay the ransom.
Now you guys have some special focus on hypervisor. Like,
Yes.
am I one of the first to hear about that?
Yeah,
hey,
you
look
are.
at that. Okay,
So-
we break
so-
news here at TAG.
One of the really cool things that we've done at Vali Cyber within the past couple months is we've extended ZeroLock to support ESXi hypervisors specifically. And
a big
the reason
market.
for that is because there are tons and tons of ransomware attacks that affect these systems. And there are native security controls within ESXi. The problem is they get bypassed by attackers because attackers, they phish or they use social engineering to gain administrative access to the systems. And once you have that sort of access, you can essentially do whatever you want. So the goal of ZeroLock on those systems is, even if you have a root level user, even if you have a user that has tons and tons of permissions over the system, they still can't launch a ransomware attack.
Right. Sometimes when I bring up Linux security, people go, "Oh, I used SE Linux, I hated it, or I didn't use it." Or what do you say when people bring up sort of some of these utilities that have been built in and around Linux that may not be as traveled or as used?
So I think your description of them as utilities is very accurate in the sense that they're not enterprise-grade security products. In the sense that you have to build infrastructure around them to be able to manage them. You also have to understand them, and a lot of organizations don't have that sort of expertise, or they just don't have the time and the bandwidth to build systems that will allow them to automate changes to policies across millions of systems or thousands of systems. And as a result, those controls tend to only be used in very large, very tech-focused companies like Meta or like Google or something like that.
Right. Now tell me about the product. So if I'm a buyer and I say, hey, I like this, I want to do it, what's the experience like? Am I POCing, or is the install easy? Do you have tools to manage the deployment? Take me through sort of that journey that you go through with your customers.
Sure. So it's a management and agent sort of architecture console. So you have a management console that interacts with an agent that gets installed on systems. And the POC process is essentially, we work with customers to identify what sorts of systems they expect it to install on in production. We install it on those systems.
Is it usually 80 bazillion different versions and configs?
Yes,
and
it depends on the customer, but many different customers are going to have different versions of Linux, especially large companies that have gone through acquisitions, because they're going to have lots of disparate architecture as a result. And
you inherit a data center and they've got who knows what running, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so the idea is to do a POC on a representative workload for what their enterprise workloads are. And so you verify that the system is performing properly, you run some attacks against it, verify it's detecting attacks. That's typically the POC process, and it runs
You guys
for
have
about,
tools that do that sort of thing?
Yeah, so we actually have a few different tools that we use to test efficacy. One of them is called MITRE Caldera. This is an open source tool. It's not something that we built, but it allows you to essentially run automated red teaming attacks against systems.
Yeah.
And there are other BAS tools that people will use that do those sorts of steps and implement those sorts of tests, and we'll work with customers to work with those tools as well. The other tool that we have built ourselves is called Security Perf. So it's an open source tool that allows you to measure the performance impact of the security tool on a system. And it does this by essentially running a workload that would run on a Linux system, like a web server or a database, and it load tests it. And so the idea is you load test the system with and without your security tool installed, and so that you know, what is the impact on my web server with this security tool installed?
And make sure there's no API thrashing or CPUs going
Exactly.
nuts. I would imagine that probably doesn't happen much, but maybe it does.
So I think that with our product it doesn't happen,
Yeah.
but I think it's a huge concern. Stability is a huge concern for the users of Linux security products because the Linux infrastructure is what is the lifeblood for that enterprise. I mean, most enterprises, that's where the money gets made, is on the Linux systems that they built. That's providing whatever SaaS service or whatever service they're providing to customers. And so as a result, you want to make sure that whatever you install on it isn't going to have any sort of negative side effects.
You know, it's very validating for me to hear that Linux has been so successful. My whole devoted the first half of my career to that. Why do you attribute, to what would you attribute that success? Is it the ease of use and the simplicity of Linux, or is it just happenstance? What happened here?
I think performance is certainly part of it. I think the fact that it's open source and free to use is a huge part of it too, so that it's easy for someone to just adopt it and start using it. I think the performance aspect is important too, because you don't think of Windows as being a solution for IoT devices. Linux is a solution for IoT devices because it can actually come in that tiny, small form factor. And because it's smaller and lighter, you can do things like support billions and billions of IoT devices on this specific operating system.
I've always struggled with Windows. Like with Linux, I always feel like if I don't know something, I can sort of figure it out, because what you would think would be the way it would work is usually the way it works. Whereas for me, it's more me, I'm no indictment of Microsoft, but it's a lot of point and click and remembering things. And to me, I just always felt like it was an awkward experience, where Unix always made so much sense to me. Everything's regular, everything's generalized. So
I can definitely relate to that
you know
point,
what I mean?
Especially because as an engineer, it's nice to be able to just look at the code. So sometimes if Linux is doing something that I don't quite understand, I can figure out exactly why, because I can just read the source code for the Linux operating system and understand why it's doing what it's doing. And now, your typical user isn't going to do that, but I think that for a technical audience and someone that's very technical in nature, that's trying to use the tool to build something unique or special, that sort of power is really important, so that you can quickly get to the source of any issues that you might be experiencing.
Awesome. Tell me about your customers. I imagine you have some big customers, like people who have big deployments. But what's the range, and what are some of the sectors? I'm guessing that's a pretty wide range, but maybe there's a few that come to mind that are more sweet spot for you guys than others.
Yeah, so we've seen our most success with sort of medium-sized business and large businesses. Work with a few Fortune 500 companies, and I think that the portability of the product is something that speaks to a lot of people because of what I was talking about earlier, where they've gone through a bunch of acquisitions, they have a very diverse IT environment, and they need a solution that's going to be able to support that entire environment. I think the other thing that we've seen is on-prem is important for a lot of organizations, and a lot of companies and security providers don't do Linux security on-prem particularly well, but Vali Cyber does, because you don't have any sort of degradation in the performance of the tool, whether it's on-prem or whether you're deploying it in the cloud with internet connectivity. That's because of the way the security works. We're not pulling information from a giant database of threats in the cloud. All the intelligence is located in a small form factor on the agent itself.
VMware will open a whole new market, I would imagine, for you guys, right?
Yes, I think so.
Hiring a bunch of new salespeople?
Yeah, directly focused on VMware. Yeah, I think that the ESXi security problem is one that's front and center for a lot of folks because there is no existing solution for those systems other than whatever native security tools they provide. And the native security tools, I think, while they work and they do some good things, they've also been shown to be inefficient when you deal with an attacker that has the ability to steal credentials or gain access to systems at an administrative level. Once you have that with ESXi before Zero Lock, you're really out of luck. But with Zero Lock, you can still protect yourself.
So I'm going to ask you for some predictions about the usual topics. Like, what, are you an AI guy? What do you think is the impact of artificial intelligence on kind of our world, on cyber, on computing, on data centers, and so on?
Sure, that's a great question. So I think that I use ChatGPT all the time. It's definitely helpful to do things like write reports or write papers and also to write code. And it's not going to write a complex program for you, but it can give you a little snippet or something.
Right.
And what it does today is it significantly increases the speed at which you're able to do things. And I think that's what we're going to see, just much like the internet did a few decades ago. I think we're going to see an acceleration at the pace at which businesses move because they're able to get things done more quickly.
What about energy efficiency and sustainability? Because you guys live with a lot of customers that run data centers and so on. What do you think will happen in the next few years? I know there's been a lot of push to making data centers more efficient, and I'm not sure that that's an OS issue so much, but you're probably pretty close to that. You think some redefinition of the way data centers and cloud operate consistent with those kinds of things is coming?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's always going to be a push on reducing power constraints and all those kind of base requirements for running a data center because that impacts money and ultimately it impacts the environment too. And I think a lot of organizations and companies are more environmentally focused today than they were a few decades ago.
So if somebody's watching us right now and they say, oh my gosh, I like Austin, I like Vali Cyber, I want to buy, what should they do? Is the website the right place?
Yep.
Or what?
I would say the website's the right place. There's a
bombard your LinkedIn?
Yeah, that would work too.
Okay.
There's a contact us link on the Vali Cyber website, so you contact us, write a little email, and it'll send a note to our sales team and we'll get in contact with you.
I hope a lot of people do. This is, I've been waiting to talk to you. This is something, again, for me, that's very much coming home. I spent, when I joined Bell Labs, I joined the Unix security group, and we were living at the application level. We were using the group identifier to do labeling. And in those days, you labeled files. It was a different security paradigm, but a lot of the same principles. You want it to be portable, wanted it to be efficient, and you guys are doing that now. I'm very proud of what you guys are doing.
Well, thank you. We're very proud of it too, and hopefully we can help do some good out there.
Please keep up the good work. We need you guys to be protecting us, so keep working hard.
Absolutely. You got it.
Thanks for coming by. And for the rest of you watching, we'll see you next time.